So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day of our conference, Medievalisms of the Screen 3, Digital Medievalisms and the Teaching of History. We are very happy and honored to have Dr. Helen Young today for our second keynote lecture. Before introducing Dr. Young, again, some housekeeping rules. Dr. Young is going to have around 1 hour to give her lecture. Then we will have half an hour for Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, feel free either to write them in the chat or to raise your hand and we will unmute you. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Young. So Dr. Helen Young is a senior lecturer in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University in Australia. Helen is also the president of the Australian New Zealand Association for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Helen co-edits the Bloomsbury series New Directions in Medieval Studies and the Journal of Historical Fictions. Helen's recent publications include Global Medievalisms, an introduction co-authored with Dr. Kavitha Muran-Finn, and articles in Continuum, Studies in Medievalisms and Humanities. Once again, Helen, we are incredibly happy and honored to have you with us for this lecture, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be here and for coming along. I'm just going to start sorting out my screen sharing. Okay. All right, is that looking like it's the start of a PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay, thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Darkinjung Young people in the colony now known as Australia, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Here, medievalism is a colonial import, inextricably woven into the ideologies that British conquest and settlement. It is also part of public history, from statues of St. George and the Dragon and Joan of Arc outside the State Library of Victoria, near where I live, to video games that we play. I also want to acknowledge that in this paper, or this paper emerges in part from an article I co-authored with Dr. Abby Hartman and Dr. Rowan Tulloch, which appeared in the 2021 Game Studies. I'm developing here some ideas from that piece to think about medievalist video games specifically. So this paper, as they often do, has developed slightly differently to how I planned it when I put together the abstract, but I hope you'll still find it interesting. So I want to begin by talking about public history. So historical video game studies, including the work of Adam Chapman, Jeremiah McCall and others, has established and theorized video games as popular narratives of the past. Video games have also been variously discussed in terms of heritage, cultural memory, and historical fictions. Approaching them through the specific lens of public history is a relatively recent scholarly move, which builds on these more established approaches, and it's where I want to sort of jump in today. So I'll begin by outlining what I mean by public history and why it's useful for thinking about video games in particular. So public history is both an academic field, which focuses on, to put it simply, pretty much what it says on the tin, how a local, national, or even international public engages with the past. It is also the practice of engagement between the public and historical material. This is typically thought of in terms of museums, monuments, and the like, but also relates to video games for two main reasons. So the first is that video games are created by the public, in the sense that even when scholarly consultants contribute to the games themselves, to the play, these sorts of things, the game maker's skills and knowledge are not primarily in scholarly historical expertise. You know, they're creating an entertainment product, by and large, not a sort of recreation of history as an educational tool, and I'll come back to this point later. The second reason that games can be thought of as public history is that games with specific historical settings like the Middle Ages or ancient Rome, or these sorts of things, are very common ways that members of the public engage with the past for extended periods of time, most people will spend longer playing a video game than they will in a museum. So key points about public history that separate it from other forms of history are that it happens outside formal pedagogical spaces of schools and universities, and has a participatory element. So it may include scholarly consultants, but is not limited to that. So as Doctors Hartman, Tulloch and I have argued, thinking about video games as public history enables us to shift the discursive framing away from the problematic concepts of legitimacy and accuracy, which are often favoured by the industry in some of the discourse around representations of history, and instead examine the political and cultural role games have in constructing a historical narrative for the general public. So a key point to consider here is that games are arguably, by their interactive nature, always educative, at least in some respects. So games teach players how to interact with the digital world, its systems and its patterns of cause and effect. Press this button to interact with this way, and so on. We can consider them then spaces that have pedagogy built into them, even when they are not used in classrooms or primarily understood to have an educative purpose. So I want to use two key concepts to explore games as public history, and I'll talk through those now, if I can get my slides to progress. There we go. All right, so these are the interactive archive, or how games can operate as explorable catalogue of historical events, objects and scenarios, and the concept of historical empathy, or how games create an emotional resonance and personal connection to the past. So I'll unpack the first of these to start with. So archives drive much of the logic of public history. Pieces of the past are collected, ordered, labelled and selectively represented to the public, sometimes, although not always, with the capacity for the public to interact or have agency in that ordering, representation and so on. Modern historical games, such as those set, say, during World War II, so games with a modern historical setting, such as those set during World War II, typically use television footage, photographs, and so on to authenticate the digital primary world of the game, as Clemens Reisner and others have shown. In some medievalist games, so for example, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Assassin's Creed 2 and others, digital renderings of still extant buildings that were originally constructed in the Middle Ages function in similar ways, as do references or appearances by historical figures, the inclusion of historical events in game narratives, and this sort of thing. General historical material as well as specific sort of surviving historical artifacts. So how that archive functions varies from game to game, depending on the nature of the material included and of the game itself. And I'll come back to this through through my exemplar games later. But there is, generally speaking, broad agreement among scholars who have written on the topic that archival elements of historical games can foster historical consciousness for players, including through counterfactual thinking, but that it does not necessarily do so. And may instead construct a sort of teleological view of history, giving players the impression that history could only have happened in one way, i.e. the way that it has. So if historical empathy is the ability to relate to the past through an understanding of, as Yilmaz writes, the mentality, frames of reference, beliefs, values, intentions, and the actions of historical agents. Such empathy will never be complete because it is impossible to read history outside of contemporary frames of reference and subjectivities. Nonetheless, historical empathy is about attempting to understand the past on its own terms, and understanding that those terms are different to those of contemporary times, and also to appreciate the perspectives, motivations, and desires of people in the past. So I will come back to these concepts when I talk about specific games in detail. I'm going to focus on two examples rather than three as I outlined in the abstract, so that there's time to cover them all in sufficient detail. and those are Crusader Kings 3 and Pentiment. These are games that came out in the last couple of years. Crusader Kings 3, I think, is probably the most, or the better known of the two, but there was a lot of buzz about Pentiment, certainly in my social media feeds from medievalists and early modernists. So I want to turn now to medievalist games more generally before I come to these specific examples, and focus on the popular gaming platform Steam. So not every game ever made is accessible there, of course, but it covers indie and AAA games and has longevity. So it's not just recent releases. You know, there are games that are a decade and more old that you can still play through Steam, much to my joy. So I'm working with the information that was correct when I put it together for this paper, so in mid-March. So it's likely to be a few game releases out of date by now, but the numbers that I'm using are fairly representative. Okay, so when you have a look at Steam, a keyword search for medieval throws up 6,242 games. And this is an unfiltered list. So the screenshot shows how it functions, simply popping up games at the top of the list that have medieval in the title first. So you might recognize a title or two, but it's fair to say that they are not the most high profile medievalist games that might immediately spring to mind. But Steam also has what are called user-defined tags, which work differently. So user-defined tags are pretty much what it says. Players can create their own sets of tags and attach them to games and link ones that already exist to games as they play and review them. So the function works a little differently. It's a more participatory kind of way of categorizing games and of approaching them. And hitting the user-defined medieval tag, and you can see that down the right-hand side of the screenshot, throws up a different set of games. Okay, and a different number. So these are the top of the list of games that players have tagged as medieval. So here we see some more well-known titles. And you can also see that there was a sale the day that I did these slides where I may have bought some. According to the user tags then, roughly half of the games makers use the word medieval to describe, so in the paratext around the games itself, are recognised as medieval enough to be called that by players. So there are 3,239 games tagged by players as medieval in the set that I'm working with. So it's interesting to me that users have tagged just around about 50% of games that come up with a keyword search. So there's a substantial body of games that are not considered medieval by the playing public, or at least not significantly enough to be labelled that way. For that to sort of matter if you're looking for games or telling somebody else about the game. So it's beyond this paper to explore the gap in significant depth, but I do want to offer one example. So Hellblade: The Senua's Sacrifice. So as you can see from the snippet on the description, it has the mythological and temporal references to be considered medievalism from a sort of medievalism studies perspective, but it's not tagged by users as medieval, even though it's set in the Viking Age with a broken Celtic warrior who embarks on a haunting vision quest into Viking hell to fight for the soul of her dead lover. Now, there's really nothing in this game, certainly that I've been able to see in the incomplete playthrough I've done, that doesn't also exist in games that are tagged medieval. So there's probably an entirely other project to compare those that are and are not tagged medieval, but it's a sort of tension point, I think, in approaching how the general public think about and label things as medieval. So coming back to our list, a figure in the low 3,000s compares to 698 user tags for World War II, which is another popular game period, 117 for ancient Rome, and 1,786 for historical. Now, this is not obviously an exhaustive list of periods in which games are set, but the comparisons clearly highlight how many medievalist games there are and their significant presence in the Steam marketplace. Okay. Now, something to note here is that 2,391 of the medieval or the games tagged medieval are also tagged fantasy. So in comparison, again, 5 of the 698 World War II games are tagged fantasy. Now, this is not surprising in the least, given the long history of medievalist fantasy that sort of permeates popular culture. It is worth noticing, however, I think, that the game playing public is evidently very comfortable with the idea that something which is fantasy is also historical enough to be termed medieval. There is a well-established discourse about gritty fantasy, so Game of Thrones and the like, or a well-established discourse that this kind of fantasy is authentically medieval. So we might then consider these games as part of the realm of public history precisely because the public accepts them as material that, or from which something can be learned about the Middle Ages. And there are, I'll add, 238 medieval games also tagged historical, leaving about 600, sorry, that should have been 1,238 medieval games also tagged historical, leaving about 600 or about 20% that are medieval, but not fantasy or historical. Now, I said I'd come back to the point about games being educative. So of our several thousand medieval games, only 22 are also tagged as for education. And here are some of them. The breadth of what is considered educational about the medieval is interesting, if somewhat confronting to those of us who do not consider the Roman Empire medieval. If you look at the one on the top, Life in a Roman Colony. My point here really is that players on Steam do not typically recognise or consider themselves to be learning anything historical, or at least not to be being educated. This is principally understood as a space for entertainment. And this is interesting, I think, when we juxtapose this with the ideas about fantasy as authentic. You know, if something's authentic, if it's real, if it's true, then necessarily we must be able to learn something true from it. But, you know, education is not a thing that players seem to want to be putting at the front of the games that they're engaging with. Now, something that becomes quite evident very quickly when exploring the various groups of tags is that almost anything from World War I to golf can be co-tagged with medieval. So here are the medieval golf games. This is again not particularly surprising given how prevalent this kind of banal medievalism is in contemporary culture. Taken in comparison with absence of similar games themed to other periods, so there's no classical Rome golf or World War II golf, for example. This suggests an oversaturation of medievalism, that it has been used so often in such a variety of ways that it becomes a mere aesthetic or perhaps even a marketing tool. So these games are examples of what could be called rebranded games, in the sense that a medieval layer has been layered over an existing game without changing the game itself in anything but the appearance. This is the sort of thing that happens with, say, Monopoly quite frequently. You know, there's Monopoly for all sorts of different cities around the world. Similar things may happen in more complex game types as well. So flight simulators are another example, which I have to say I was surprised to see. But so it's hard to imagine a player choosing these games primarily for their medievalness. Rather, the game type is the point, with the sort of popular medieval conventions and aesthetic laid over it to create an additional layer of pleasure for players who like that sort of thing. So thinking about these games as public history may seem a bit ridiculous at first. There is no past to engage with as heritage or history for a public here. However, what I would suggest is that medieval tagged games like these function to both create and maintain a presentist relationship with the past. Players are taught that the medieval is endlessly malleable and available for their pleasure in the contemporary moment. It's also quite clear from these golf and flight simulator games that there is no assumption of historicity attached to what is recognised or at least named as medieval by players on Steam. There is a dominant aesthetic of gritty medieval, so dark and dirty, a la Skyrim, Game of Thrones, and so on. But it's common rather than inevitable, as you can see from the more colourful thumbnails that are on the screen at the moment. So Poco and Dungeon is not particularly dark or gritty, although some of the others there are. All right, so exploring every one of the more than 3,000 medieval games tagged that way on Steam is beyond me, but my sense is that a high proportion of these games function in this principally aesthetic way to varying degrees. It is comparable, although not identical, to medieval settings in popular genre fiction such as romance, crime, and fantasy. So some of these games are driven fundamentally by the conventions of either the game type or the genre, or a combination of both, whereas in others, their historicity is critical to the narrative and the meaning of the work. Now, the themes and moods and features categories, which you can see down the left of the screen with the different tags attached to them, reveal tags that give insights into both dominant habits and undercurrents in what is recognised as medieval. So about 100 are tagged as having a female protagonist. There are more where playing a female character is possible. So, for example, the 3 Dragon Age games. But these tend not to be tagged by players as female protagonists if it's an option. The very small number, so about 3% of the overall set, reflects an assumed central masculinity in both games generally, but also specifically medievalist games and medievalism more broadly. So there's no male protagonist tag. So we're assuming that it's a male protagonist unless specified otherwise. So the 2 that are part of bigger franchises that you can see here, so from Kingdom Come Deliverance and the one at the bottom, Thronebreaker, Witch's Tale, are add-ons to major male-centered games that were critiqued for lacking female representation, including, but not only, the inability to play a female character. So these are fundamentally afterthoughts. Even fewer medieval games, about 50, are tagged as having LGBTQ plus content. And there's some crossover here with those that have a female protagonist. This demonstrates something like what Adrian Rich terms compulsory heterosexuality. So again, the very small proportion of content. Again, some games that have that sort of content, and I'm coming back to Dragon Age as an example here, where it's sort of optional, are not tagged in this way. There is no tag for BIPOC, diversity, or anything similar that would indicate games that break the habit of whiteness associated with popular medievalisms, although they do exist. So Pentiment, for example, which I'll talk about later, is set in Eastern Europe. It features a minor Ethiopian non-player character. Age of Empires 2 includes maps, play spaces in Asia, Central America, and other parts of the globe outside Europe. And you can play as historical peoples that were dominant in those areas. So medieval is not limited to Europe or to white people in these games or in the entire game set, but it's certainly clearly a habit. And the fact that there's no recognition, there is a current of recognition in video games that medieval doesn't necessarily mean just white people in Europe, but no clear articulation of this or a way to track it through user-generated tags. So I can come back to this a little in questions if people are interested, but I want to suggest that this makes that current of or sort of perhaps an opening out towards a more global Middle Ages seem incidental, peripheral, even more than those tags that are focused on gender and sexuality, because it's something that you can't look for. You can't say this is a thing that this game does, and you can't therefore find it except by accident or hearsay. What we can see then is that video games as public history predominantly, albeit not uniformly, reinforce stereotypical constructions of the Middle Ages as white, heterosexual, and masculine. They teach things that players, by and large, already know. This is not surprising, I think, but worth observing nonetheless. I want to turn now to how the gameness of games, that is, some of the features that make them differ from other media and kinds of public history. So the top level genres, and these are lists sort of created by Steam, are interesting, I think. I should say that these are not mutually exclusive tags, so there's considerable overlap. And I want to focus particularly on RPG or role-playing games and strategy, the two most common top-level genres. They have an overlap of about 1,500 games, so about 50% of the set, including, as you can see here, some big name titles. Put simply, in a role-playing game, RPG, as the name suggests, the player takes on a role, persona or character, and plays through their narrative via structured decision-making. So they're the protagonist and really function as the center of the game world, even when sort of in some instances where large important events happen off screen. In a strategy game, the player makes decisions about a series of developing situations, each of which results from the previous decision or decisions. The player is seeking to achieve a specific final goal to sort of win the game. The typical goal of strategy games is to acquire power and build your kingdom / dynasty / civilization. Strategy games present in some ways a somewhat, I suppose, Marxist perspective on history, with their focus on materiality, gathering resources, building towns and cities, creating armies, internal and external politics, and so on. They tend to be more to do with a kind of broad sweep of history than a specific single or sort of narrative with a single protagonist at the center of it, although the crossovers make for some interesting case studies. And there has been some interesting work on historicity of one of the biggest franchises in the genre, Sid Meier's Civilization. So I want to explore how games with this particular common combination operate through the example of Crusader Kings 3, as you can helpfully see at the top of the screen, thinking about the concept of the interactive archive and historical empathy, and considering how RPG and strategy as game genres relate to these concepts. So I suspect that Crusader Kings 3 will be very familiar to at least some of you. So I hope I'm not repeating too much that you already know. So it takes place in a digital version of the real world, or at least it seems to start there, as this map, which was released during the development phase, illustrates. So the player aims to create a powerful dynasty that can begin from any region of the map and is linked to historical historically powerful icons, people from that region. So the Premyslids in Bohemia, Godwin in England, for example. The dates beginning in either 867 or 1066, so the respective starts of Viking raids and the Norman conquest of England, are the possible beginnings for the game, and it ends in 1453, the year of the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans, or never, depending on whether the player manually changes the settings. The start dates are of relatively little historical significance outside England and its immediate neighbours, and what happens in 1453 depends on the individual game. These historical references are authenticating and position the game as historical. It is, I'll suggest, counter-historical. That is something like a counterfactual or an alternative history. In neo-medievalist terms, a simulacrum of history, taking place in what Stefan Ekman terms the primary rather than the actual world or secondary world of fantasy. Excuse me for a moment. Now, there isn't much in the way of conventionally archival material, manuscripts, recreated buildings, etc. in Crusader Kings 3. The map and dates chiefly serve this function. Certainly there are aspects of the game where historical events become part of the play, but we don't have those digital renderings of material objects that are often used in that way. So documents, buildings, this sort of thing to a substantial degree. But we can nonetheless consider this part of the archival material, focusing on the interactive part of the concept of the interactive archive. As Metzger and Paxton explain, video games have dynamic interactivity, doing things in response to game elements through which the game narrative is subsequently developed or changed. Watching and even mentally engaging with a history movie does not change the film, but gameplay changes a game's outcomes and generates different narrative experiences. So there is potential for the game to generate historical consciousness through the counterfactual narrative each player develops uniquely to each playthrough. That is, each playthrough of the game creates a feeling of history that might have been, rather than a history that was. So repeated playthroughs potentially reveal the contingency of history, which is to say that they highlight that it did not have to happen the way that it did, and that a variety of forces and decisions have an effect. Any playthrough of Crusader Kings 3 does not tell us the story of history as it was or is, but is nonetheless a particular version of history as it might have been that feels true without being factually correct. This comes with caveats, however. A range of innovations, legal, technological, and ideological elements are linked in the game to historical eras, so time periods that pass as one plays through. So I don't have time to elaborate fully, but this slide from the game wiki gives you a sense of what the eras are and how they work. So in each era, a specific set of military, civic, and cultural innovations, some of which are linked to particular regions, must be developed before the culture can progress. So the culture being what the player is playing, effectively, who you are playing as. Now, these innovations range from crop rotation and building barracks in the tribal era to plate armor, noblesse oblige, and Renaissance thought in the later medieval era. They function, I would argue, as part of the interactive archive of history in the game, authenticating the experience of playing as history-like. What we have then is a structure that constructs history, with a capital H, as progression towards a version of the modern Western world. I'm thinking here about Renaissance thought develops in the late medieval era. So much for periodization. These innovations are tangible historical developments and their use in the game suggests that modernity as we know it is inevitable, no matter what sort of political decisions one makes, who one plays as, all of these things. Modernity is still marching through in a particular way. So it suggests that certainly Western modernity of the present is inevitable, even as it shows that natural boundaries of the modern era are not. Okay, so as I said, I know many folk have played Crusader Kings 3, but I want to show you the trailer to give you a sense of what it's like before I talk about the RPG elements and historical empathy. So hopefully this worked when we tested it. Hopefully this will work. Okay. All right.
Peggy 16. Your brother was lost thanks to the deceit and treachery of your enemies. Now, the weight of your bloodline lies on your shoulders. Be thankful to your enemies, for they teach you the ways to power. You must learn the ways of commerce and combat, but never fight with swords when a dagger will do. Keep your enemies close. The first step in avoiding the trap is knowing it is there. Real strategy requires cunning. Remember that, and your dynasty will rule this land through the ages.
So in oh bother. Okay, in Crusader Kings 3 then, taking it as an example of the combination of RPG and strategy games, we're presented with what is essentially Thomas Carlyle's great man theory of history in game form. The player is positioned through the game as a great man or woman if they so choose. Carlyle meant specifically men and specifically white men. But the player, ideally, or the player character has the necessary attributes to wrest order from chaos, that is, war and politics, by accruing power of different kinds. This fundamentally heroic construction is absolutely conventional in RPGs, especially medievalist ones, like, say, The Witcher, the Dragon Age franchises. The RPG type element in Crusader Kings 3 adds a dimension of complexity to the gameplay, comparatively with strategy games that don't have it. So the player character has traits that can be passed down to their heirs, and that affects their statistics and behavior. So making decisions that go against their character traits, for example, increases their stress levels and has an impact within the game. This is fairly limited compared to RPG forward games like Kingdom Come Deliverance or, again, Dragon Age. And the latter also has strategy elements. So if we think about this in terms of historical empathy, there are two things to note. The first is that the position of the player category as the founder of a dynasty and the leader of a people encourages players to empathize with the category of person whose perspectives and positions are commonly centered in existing historical accounts. So there's very little capacity in a game like this, well, for the subaltern to speak, I might say, to see history from a perspective that is different to a sort of received mainstream history. So The counterfactual of the game, moreover, is a simulacrum of the past, and does not subscribe, I suggest, closely enough to any concrete historical reality to generate more than a sort of generalized understanding, a consciousness of the contingent nature of history rather than any sort of empathy. There is potential variance, of course, depending on what individual players do outside the game or to inform their play, but the game itself has these limitations, perhaps necessarily given the strategy element, or the very strong strategy element. So I want to turn now to my second example game, Pentiment, which I might have to bother.
Thanks to the deceit and treachery of your...
Oh, we don't want to watch it all again. Sorry. Okay, that's it. So I'll give you the trailer of this as well, and to start with, because it is perhaps a less well-known game, and to show you the look and feel, and the ways that employs a fairly recognisable medieval manuscript aesthetic, or medievalist aesthetic at any rate. Okay.
Redemit oes, Christus in os patri.
Okay, so in Pentiment, you play as Andreas, a manuscript illustrator in a small town in the Bavarian Alps at the time of the Reformation. A murder occurs, and the player must uncover clues and eventually tell the monks of the abbey and the townspeople who they think was responsible. And you're not actually shown the murders, so as the player, there's a lot of variation in how the game develops depending on different choices that you make. And you never actually know if you're right about who the killer was or why it happened. So depending on the players, I mean, it's in that sense, it's functionally quite a familiar medievalist crime fiction in game form. So depending on the player's choices at multiple places in the game, so for example, oh, not again. Okay, here we go. So for example, Andreas's education specialization when he was at university with Martin Luther, there are different narrative threads to pursue and different endings. It's a point and click adventure game. There are no puzzles or combat and so on. It differs quite substantially from the RPG and strategy types that I was talking about so far that tend to be very prominent in the marketplace. So the game is not tagged by users as educational, but it functions in interesting ways as an interactive archive. There are historical facts that can be accessed at various points in the dialogue that help you make sense of the world that your character inhabits. So, for example, this one, when you're having a conversation with a local lord, a patron of the abbey, and the priest in the village, you talk about, I forgot, oh yeah, Worms has been the site of many imperial diets. So you get historically contextual information that you can choose as the player to look at or not, if you either are not interested or already know it, I suppose. Okay, so this sort of information is littered through as an interactive archive. So it's not there in the sense that you have to read it, but it's interactive in the sense that as the player, you can choose to or not. So these are optional, clicking on the glossaries, but other pieces of historical information are built into the dialogue. So, for example, you have a conversation about Andreas's education with the patron of the abbey, and this occurs as you're sort of walking through the village with them, and the two discuss basic facts relating to medieval education, depending on what choice was made. So, so in this game, I've said that Andreas studied rhetoric, but he can have studied theology, these sorts of things. So these bits of information, and you can see the underlined text there, we'll click through to glosses that tell you who Augustine was, who Thomas Aquinas was, and so on. So these pieces of historical archive of information are both optional, but also built into the game itself, woven into the game. So the players' interactions and agency, the choices that they must make to play the game, are linked to the archival material in tangible ways. They're meaningful in the game narrative. So some of the choices that your character of Andreas faces differ depending on what you say his education was. So the branching options that result from such decisions shape the game itself. The interactive archive is part of the game narrative and the player's experience. So it's central to the gameplay. It informs the player's decisions, which result in different narrative pathways and experiences. This, I would suggest, substantially increases the capacity of Pentiment to potentially generate historical empathy, because it increases knowledge and understanding of the historical context of the player character. The player acts as an agent in a recreated past, learning not just facts about medieval rhetoric, for example, but how the digital historical world functions, including socially. So there are layers of learning going on in a game like this. Now, I don't suggest that Pentiment is a perfect recreation of the medieval past. The genre features of the medieval crime narrative are certainly part of the game, so there's conspiracy, this sort of thing. However, the sense of a day-to-day experience of a medieval world in the game is significant and aligns with findings with research from research into similar games set in other periods. So the focus on a particular character, we also see Andreas's interiority. So in some conversations, you can work through thought bubbles that he has and sort of reflect further on not just the nature of his character in a sort of role-playing way, but also on the historical context that he inhabits. And that sort of focus and possibility of engaging with his thoughts and how he would have thought about the world around him in particular has been shown to generate historical empathy in other games that have similar mechanics. So if Crusader Kings 3 has potential to help players understand the contingent nature of history writ large over centuries, Pentiment, with its character focus narrative that develops over only a few days and night rather than the entire sweep of medieval history, offers a much more human experience, and therefore I would suggest a much greater capacity to generate historical empathy. So considering games as part of the practice of public history at a macro level, in terms of the broad patterns that emerge from user tags on Steam, confirms much of what researchers in medievalism studies have variously argued. The Middle Ages are understood to be white, masculine, and heterosexual, in part because this is what is typically taught about them. Players learn this from repetition of the same patterns. They also render the medieval as a space for fantasy, storytelling, and history that feels authentic but isn't. Focusing on specific games, Crusader Kings and Pentiment, demonstrates that what can be learned about the medieval through video gaming is more nuanced and complex than these broad brushstrokes might suggest. I would argue that the connection between the interactive archive, how games use historical material of different kinds, and the potential to generate historical empathy is very close. Without archival material that is crucially integrated into the gameplay in meaningful ways, it is functionally impossible for players to develop an understanding of the past on its own terms. In Pentiment, despite the more lurid aspects of the games like conspiracy and violence that derive largely from the conventions of crime fiction, players can learn not only facts about the medieval, but a feeling for it. We might therefore usefully consider medievalism more broadly through the lens of public history as a space of participatory pedagogy, where scholars and the public engage with each other and potentially also learn from each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. That was really a great lecture. Very, very interesting. You have touched upon many topics, from the malleability of the medieval past to the way in which we perceive it, to how gamers seem to engage with gaming, how do they seem to understand learning, etc. Again, like many topics that I'm sure that are going to lead to many questions. So again, remember that if you have any questions, you can either write them in the chat or raise your hand and we will unmute you. In the meantime, I think then I will abuse my privileges as the chair of the session. And I will ask the first couple of questions myself to get the conversation going. There are two elements that caught my attention that I would like to ask, maybe to know your opinion about this. The first one is what you precisely mentioned about the way in which gamers who engage with these games, how do they seem to understand learning? As you mentioned, there are thousands of games about the Middle Ages, but only a handful of what does it mean, or that are categorized as education. And this is something that I have also seen in the research that I'm doing, that gamers might learn something from these games, but they do not engage with the games in terms of learning. So something that I was wondering, and I would like to know your opinion about this. You also mentioned that although these games can give the illusion of giving different perspectives, they tend to reinforce the same normative, hegemonical understandings of the period. And I wonder if there's maybe a relationship between these two, since games tend to recreate popular and ideas of the past that sell well, that do not give any new insight into the past. Maybe that is something that is impacting the idea of I am not necessarily learning something. That would be the first question. And the second question that I would also like to know or maybe to ask you to go a little bit deeper into, is the issue of historical empathy and the emotional engagement with the past that video games allow. This is something that I have also been thinking a lot lately, but I mean, as a gamer, I can understand what I mean, but I've always found it problematic to try to actually put into words what does it mean to engage emotionally with the past through the interaction of a video game. So I don't know if maybe you could help me a little bit with that, to try to flesh out that idea, because again, in my mind it's clear because I'm used to playing games, but I've always found it difficult to actually articulate it when I'm writing or when I'm trying to explain it to someone. So those would be my two questions.
Okay. So thinking about the first question, I mean, I think, and like you, my sense of how players, and this is mainly based on, things I read on discussion forums. It's not something that I've conducted a sort of systematic research into, but and I'm reading other scholarship as well, I guess, is that, yeah, players by and large don't talk about games as something that they learn from, unless the question somehow comes up, right? So it's not a thing that's forward in their minds usually when they're talking about or perhaps playing a game. I mean, nobody really plays a game, certainly not through their own Steam account, for the purpose of learning about the Middle Ages. That's what we've got Wikipedia for, right? If you want to know a date, that's what you might look at. So I think this is partly to do with the context of games. There are games that we know are educational, that we know we're supposed to learn history from. I don't know, Oregon Trail, something like that. And so games that are commercially produced and kind of made for the purpose of making money, or for the purpose of entertainment, education is not forward in those games, and it's also not what people are looking for. I think it's Henri Lefebvre who writes about how people don't like popular culture, particularly when it's aimed at adults. They don't like thinking that they've learned anything from it. They don't want it to be serious. They just want it to be entertainment. And so there's, on one hand, people don't think of it as educational, but also they resist the idea that it might be. But you then also get people saying that, they know the Middle Ages were, I don't know, I'm sort of plucking out some exemplars here. They know that everybody in Europe was white because that's what it's like in The Witcher, and that's very authentic. So I'm paraphrasing here. So so I think you're right that there is a connection between the way that a lot of games are created and marketed, and that sense that they don't perhaps want to do too much that's different. And so there's almost always at least the option to play a medieval game as a white heterosexual male. And when there's the variation that's possible, okay, that's fine. That's, that's something that might be marketed or put forward as a kind of, okay, well, we're going to market this game to a non-core gamer audience, or people who are understood as not being the core of the kind of typical gamer. So yeah, I think there's certainly a connection between production, marketing, people not wanting to learn too much, and also a desire, and it's absolutely not universal, but a desire in a significant set of the marketplace to be given what you're expecting. On the other hand, there are certainly games and medieval games that challenge some of those things, sort of particularly around identity. So I'm thinking of, say, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where it's clear that or as you play through, sorry, spoilers, that the protagonist is supposed to be a female character, that character in, the real version of the game world is female, or was female. So there are some variations there. In terms of the second question about, am I remembering rightly that you were asking about sort of how to articulate the matter of historical empathy?
No, maybe moving before moving to the second question, because I would like maybe to interject into something into the first one that just came to mind. Because then something that I do find very interesting is, as you say, then players maybe do not think of their engagement in terms of learning. Maybe they don't think that they want to learn anything from the game. But then something that I find also very interesting is that maybe they don't, or these players do not see the need to learn anything because they think that they already know it. Hence, sometimes the very strong backlash that you get when you try to portray the period in a different way that we would consider more accurate, right? The case that comes to mind is Aurelia Brandenburg's study on the reaction to The Witcher 3, which is not a historical game, but there was backlash to a review that claimed that there is no people of color, the way in which they treat women, and the response was, "What do you expect? That's how the Middle Ages was when." And so the fact that using incorrect information to justify something in a fantasy game, which I think is also like very interesting. So it's not only that maybe they don't want to learn anything, maybe it's also that they necessarily don't, they feel that they already know it, and hence it is simply not necessary.
Yes, I think there's both of those things. I mean, I think a lot of the what we might call backlash, a lot of those sort of discussions have a lot more to do with kind of contemporary identity politics than they do about anything that people really kind of think matters about, or than they do with any historical fact about the Middle Ages. Right. The logic falls apart when you say, okay, it's The Witcher, it's full of fantasy stuff. It's not really history. So why would you say, oh, we can't have women portrayed in this way, we can't have people of color, these sorts of things, when we can have all this magic stuff? So that when you start to kind of unpick the logic there, it becomes very clear that yeah, people, yes, already think they already know something, but that what they think they already know is connected to a sense of identity in the present, because otherwise, why does it matter so much? Why would you threaten people with violence, make death threats, this kind of thing about what's in a game, unless it matters to you in a way that's really significant in the real world, in the now.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. So maybe, I don't know if you wanted then to move to the second question, to the emotional engagement.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in some ways, I think the term historical empathy is a little bit misleading, but it's the one that kind of scholars are using at the moment, because it suggests that you have some kind of perhaps a strong feeling or a strong emotional connection, whereas I think what we're really getting at, or I guess the kind of thing that I'm particularly interested in, is that capacity of games to more help you get inside the head of character, and kind of function within the world in a way where you as the player have agency that you obviously don't watching a TV show or movie, this kind of thing. So it's more about understanding the past and the people of the past on its own terms than necessarily having a kind of strong emotion that we would typically think of as being generated by a game. What do you feel when you play a game? Well, either I enjoy it or it irritates me and I stop playing, right? So we kind of tend to think about the emotions relating to play as being predominantly pleasure, right? But that's not what historical empathy is, or not what, I guess, academics who theorize historical empathy might be generated through a game. It's not about, oh, well, do you like the person? Do you like your character? This kind of thing. It's more about understanding what we think the past might have been like as recreated through the digital world. So my feeling is, I mean, I've used historical empathy in this paper because it's the term that kind of best suits what I mean. But I'm not sure that the emotionality is the most important element. When you sort of think about games as sites of play and pleasure, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about what you kind of, what it is you mean by the emotionality of games that you we're talking about.
That I think that's precisely part of the problem, right? Of course, on the one hand, what you mentioned is like the enjoyable experience of engaging with a game, right? I don't know, if you play a historical game and you finish it, and this like feeling of both like happiness and pleasure of having played, but also of a little bit of nostalgia of having finished the game, and that it is something that is done, right? The thing is that I believe that these type of emotions can be used as powerful rhetorical tools to convey experiences of the past that somehow is very difficult to do in other forms of media. Now, what would be the actual minutia of that? That's the part that I find it difficult. To give you, I don't know, maybe a gaming example that comes from my own experience. I remember when I played the Assassin's Creed 2, like the whole story from Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood and Revelations. I remember finishing Revelations, and it was this very, I mean, that's the thing, that it's difficult like to try to articulate it in words, because it's to some extent like a very personal experience of what you felt, you went through with the story, with the characters, with the settings, with the events, etc. Of course, part of that is indeed the pleasure of having played a good game. Also, on the other hand, part of that can be a type of empathy of what that you relate to the character that you're using, but that maybe has more to do with modern understandings of yourself, of your own identity, and of your own understanding of the past than the past itself. That's the part that I always find like difficult to try to connect when also trying to use video games as rhetorical tools to convey meaningful history in ways that is powerful, but that other media that do not allow. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, because again, in my own experience, I've always found it difficult to try to articulate how these different emotions work together, and how I personally believe they could actually be used as pedagogical tools to offer an emotional approach to the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real challenge. You know, I wonder if one of the things that, or something that might be useful to think about, is it's hard to put into words, right? But that we have, if you play through, say, a game like Assassin's Creed 2, what's that, like 80 hours of gameplay, any game that's of substance, there is an emotional, I think there's an affective connection, in that it's not just an intellectual proposition. It's not just, oh, I want to know how the story ends, or what's this conspiracy really about. Like there's different layers of engagement, and the affect in there, rather than, and I sort of mean affect as a grab bag term for feelings that don't have names, right? There's pleasure. Well, that's perhaps an emotion. I might love this game. It might make me angry, these kind of named emotions. But if we think about and talk about affect as a sense of feeling and perhaps even like a desire for the past. So Stephanie Trigg and Thomas Prendergast have a book called Affective Medievalisms, where they talk about a kind of distinctive feature of medievalism being the desire to touch the past. And I think that's something that video games, I'm going to say embody, but exemplify perhaps really well because of that interactive nature. I'm always a little bit skeptical of arguments that say, oh, well, this medium is profoundly different to this one and it's all about the medium. But I do think that games have a capacity to engage over a period of time and in different ways to most other kind of media in which we experience medievalism. And to play through a whole game takes an affective commitment. So I don't know that I have a really useful answer to that question.
I mean,
beyond saying yes, it's a difficult one.
It's definitely very useful because it does give to, like, again, these, I'm gonna check that book. I really didn't know it. I'll take a look at it because I think there's something like this idea of trying, like, to the idea of touching, of actually seeing the past. Well, I think I have already monopolized the questions too much. We have a question in the chat from Kathleen Sene, who is one of our professors here at the Department of Medieval Studies at CEU. And she says or Kathy, would you like to ask the question directly, or should I read it? Okay, could you? Oh no, she wrote me. Okay, I'll read it. I'll read it. So it says the following: the idea of the interactive archive behind the games opens up various avenues, including the one to make games more educational for various age groups. Do you think that a non-commercial game development strategy could take actual archival documents as the basis of better understanding the past, or are the costs of developing a game too prohibitive to go in a non-commercial way? Do you think that there can be a continuum between gaming and data visualization?
I think this is a really interesting space. I have a research project I'm trying to get funded at the moment, which includes game development, but we went with tabletop role-playing games because even though I'm in a communication school with video gaming, kind of significant video gaming capacity, it was just beyond the resources that we might have been able to have to produce something that is really substantial in the marketplace. That said, my second year students produce indie games in a trimester, so over an 11-week period over they'll be doing it in the second half of this year. So a lot of it depends on the resources that are available, but also on what you're actually aiming for. I don't think that the kind of logic of the marketplace is ever going to take, a major AAA game, that kind of thing, and make it education forward. Right, but there is absolutely capacity for games that do, reflect the archive in really interesting ways to be created. But it depends on who's leading the project and what the aims are for how well that's going to work and what's actually required. So some of the educative games that are tagged in Steam, one of them is a virtual reality recreation of Guildford Castle. Right, and that kind of thing takes some pretty significant resources to create. And in a marketplace like Steam, it's not got a lot of reviews. It's the sort of thing that somebody who's already interested might say, okay, this is cool, I'm going to have a look at this. or that might be used in a more formal pedagogical setting, but not the kind of thing that is going to get a lot of people kind of playing it in their spare time. It's not the kind of entertainment versus education balance. I think can often be quite tricky to get right. And absolutely, there are games that are made with that sort of purpose. And some of them are those ones that are tagged to education, that potentially teach something about the Middle Ages that might not otherwise be known. So one of the ones that was on that list was about a tile maker who makes mosaics in Caliphate, Spain. So there's a perspective there, and some historical information there, and that's central to the game. It's obviously been created and reasonably well resourced with an educative purpose in mind. But I suspect that given the state of research funding almost everywhere, certainly that I know of, in a practical sense, creating large complex games for non-commercial use that have the same kind of production values that a commercial game has is relatively unusual, and kind of beyond the capacities of universities to be the starting point for. So Assassin's Creed, some of those games have museum mode where you can cruise around ancient Greece and pick up objects and just look at stuff, and it's all linked to different museums and different historical information. But that's something that's come from the game maker, and that's part of their whole discourse of saying that their game is authentic. Oh, look, it's so authentic, it's like a digital museum. But that's not something that's kind of been, all right, some academics think this is a good idea and they've got the research, they've got the resources from a funding body to create. So yeah, that was perhaps a more pessimistic answer than it might have been.
Okay. Thank you for.
I suppose in some relatively small game and often quite local ones, augmented reality, virtual reality, those kinds of things can work really well in a kind of heritage environment. But breaking into high-level production values, kind of high-impact games, I think is another level of challenge that we're not up to meeting yet.
I mean, I think you're right in that sometimes more on these type of engagements come more from smaller studios and more indie type of studios. Again, one of the examples that I think is very illustrative of this is precisely Vít Schiller at Charles University in Prague, right? I think they have a game developing unit within the university, and they have developed a couple of educational / more meaningful history games that you can actually find them on Steam. Okay, thank you for that, Kathy. Which other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, Sabina, I will allow you to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for your paper. It was really interesting. I have a question that is about pedagogy and more about what you think these games are trying to do, particularly about Pentiment, which has been on my Steam list for ages and I haven't managed to play it yet. So you're talking about this idea of they're trying to make sense of the world, like the idea that you get information and you're trying to make sense of the medieval world through the information you're gathering. how do you think that's affected by the fact that you can pick and choose what information you're gathering? Like you can choose what you're engaging with, what educational material you're engaging with. How does that affect our sense of the medieval, our feelings about the medieval, our emotional empathy?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, and the game is interesting because you can play it quite successfully without really engaging with any of the historical material and without kind of understanding, well, you gave Andreas a rhetoric training, and therefore this is why he can do these particular things. As a player, when you kind of think about different branches in the pathways, you can look back and say, oh, okay, he can do this thing because he's got the rhetoric training, not theology, or I forget the others off the top of my head. So I think I think this is always the case. There's capacity in the game to fall back on a stock phrase, generate historical empathy, but it can't actually do anything if, as a player, you're not open to it or interested in it. The information, a lot of the information in the glossaries is only helpful if you're really trying to work out all the details of why this noble lord wants to quiz you about Martin Luther, and what might happen if you talk to him about that at the prior's table at dinner. But if you're just kind of playing through it because it looks like a fun game, and okay, I like crime fiction, I want to know who did it and kind of figure this stuff out. So I don't think that there's, I think we do need to be really careful about overclaiming, because it's so dependent on how individual players actually engage with what's there. So it's got capacity to do some interesting things, and I think the ways that information is threaded through the dialogue as kind of non-optional kind of leads the player in particular directions. You're supposed to click on some of that stuff, but it would take forever if you clicked on everything to read like every possible historical contextualizing thing. So it's all about capacity rather than actually doing a thing, or in making us feel empathy. It doesn't make us feel anything. You can just,
So it's what we tell our students all the time, which is narrow your focus, and they just made it too wide.
Right. Yeah. And don't expect too much from the game. Like it's I suspect it's really interesting to medievalists and early modernists, because it's like, oh, this is the kind of game I would like to play. It's got all this great stuff. Oh, my students could learn so many things from it. But also they might just be like, oh, there was a conspiracy and the villagers killed somebody. Like, oh, that's just like the Middle Ages, very violent.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we might have time for one more question. If anybody from the audience has a question or a comment for Helen, which it seems that there is not. So if there's not, then I think we can end the session there. Helen, once again, thank you very much for your lecture. This was very, very interesting. And I hope that our audience also, I'm sure that our audience also enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks for inviting me. It was a real pleasure.
So before closing the session, because again, we need to close the session in order to convert the recording. Remember that we will have our next panel in roughly half an hour, a little bit over half an hour. Our next panel is entitled Medieval Digital Preservation and Research. So we're going to move to a sort of the more different topic based on digital humanities and digital research. Again, you can use the same link to access that panel, and we'll see you in roughly half an hour. Thank you very much.